Japan has bullet trains, robot restaurants, and vending machines that sell things you didn't know you needed at 2 in the morning. But underneath all that efficiency is another Japan, one that's been quietly emptying out for decades. Coal towns swallowed by forest, amusement parks left to rust, and entire islands that went from thousands of people to almost nobody in the span of a generation. Here are the 11 ghost towns in Japan you're not supposed to know. Number 11. Nara Dreamland, Nara Prefecture. Let's start with the most dramatic one, and, technically, the most deceased one, since Nara Dreamland no longer exists. In 1961, a Japanese businessman named Kunizo Matsuo opened a theme park outside of Nara that was, to put it charitably, a very enthusiastic tribute to Disneyland. It had its own version of Sleeping Beauty's castle, its own Main Street, its own Matterhorn, its own monorail, and its own Jungle Cruise. Matsuo had originally approached Walt Disney about licensing the real thing, but the deal collapsed over franchise fees, and rather than abandon the concept entirely, he just built a very recognizable version of it anyway. In its peak years, the park attracted more than 1.6 million visitors annually. Then Tokyo Disneyland opened in 1983, and attendance at Nara Dreamland started dropping. Then Universal Studios Japan opened in Osaka in 2001. Attendance dropped further, to around 400,000 a year. By 2004, rides were rusting, shops were closing, and the park had the general atmosphere of somewhere that had already given up but hadn't been officially informed yet. On August 31st, 2006, after 45 years of operation, Nara Dreamland closed permanently. What followed was a decade of extraordinary decay that made it one of the most photographed Haikyo sites in Japan. The ticket booths still had maps and brochures in them. Office supplies sat on desks. The castle's doors swung in the wind. In 2013, the city government auctioned the site. No bids came in. In 2015, they tried again, and an Osaka-based real estate company finally bought it. Demolition began in October 2016 and was completed on December 21st, 2017. 30 rides and 75 buildings were removed from the site. The land now sits under strict zoning regulations that prevent commercial or residential development. A children's Disneyland knockoff with no children. Abandoned for a decade, demolished, and turned into a zoning problem. Only in Japan. Number 10. Yubari, Hokkaido. Yubari is not a ruin in the traditional sense. People still live there, just not very many, and fewer every year. In the 1960s, Yubari was the coal capital of Hokkaido. At its peak, the city had approximately 120,000 residents, making it one of the largest cities on Japan's northern island. Then Japan shifted from coal to imported oil, and the mines began closing. By 1990, when the last colliery shut down, the population had already fallen to 21,000. It has since halved again. As of 2024, roughly 6,000 people remain, the majority of them elderly. The city has more residents over 80 than under 40. For every child born in Yubari, approximately 12 people die. Aware that the mines were closing, city officials tried to pivot to tourism in the late 1970s, building museums, amusement parks, and leisure facilities on borrowed money and government subsidies. Few visitors came. The debt mounted. In 2007, Yubari became the first municipality in Japan to formally declare bankruptcy. Half of the city's government officials resigned within weeks. Municipal workers, including the mayor, were left drawing some of the lowest salaries in Japan. The logic of building a tourism economy in a city that nobody was visiting was, in retrospect, questionable. But Yubari's leadership was under genuine pressure. The alternative, acknowledging that the city had no future, was not a policy position anyone was willing to articulate. So they built a coal mining-themed amusement park, opened museums, and hoped for visitors who never arrived in sufficient numbers to make the mathematics work. By 2008, demolition of the failed amusement park had already begun, leaving behind the debt and none of the attraction. The empty miners' row houses are slowly being reclaimed by forest. Sika deer now roam streets that used to carry workers to their shifts. There is a film festival, the Yubari International Fantastic Film Festival, which Quentin Tarantino attended in 1993, and which inspired him to name a character in Kill Bill Go-Go Yubari. But its international edition was eventually suspended due to lack of funds. The train line that served Yubari Station, operating for 127 years, was closed in March 2019. Yubari is frequently described by demographers as a preview of what many Japanese cities will look like in 2050. That is either a very useful warning or a very depressing one, depending on how you feel about ignoring warnings. The city itself has made a kind of peace with its situation. It is now most famous for its melons, a premium agricultural product sold under the Yubari King brand, and for a bear mascot with a melon for a head called Melon Kuma, which has a habit of looking absolutely terrifying in photographs. It is not the legacy most cities would choose, but it is the one Yubari has. Number 9. Hashima Island, Gunkanjima, Nagasaki Prefecture. Hashima Island is the most famous ghost town in Japan and one of the most dramatic abandoned places on Earth. A small concrete island that once held the highest population density of any place in the world and now holds nothing at all. The island sits about 15 kilometers from the city of Nagasaki. Coal was first discovered here around 1810, and Mitsubishi purchased the island in 1890 to develop the seabed coal mines beneath it. Over the following decades, Mitsubishi built high-rise concrete apartment blocks, a school, a hospital, a cinema, shops, and a seawall around the entire island. At its peak in 1959, Hashima held 5,259 people on a surface area of just 6.3 hectares, a population density that exceeded any city on the planet at the time. The island's shape, with its concrete buildings rising above the seawall, looked like a battleship on the horizon. It earned the nickname Gunkanjima, Battleship Island, and the name stuck. As Japan moved from coal to petroleum through the 1960s, the mines became less viable. Mitsubishi officially closed the mine in January 1974, and by April, all residents had departed. The island was abandoned overnight, with personal belongings, furniture, and school materials left exactly as they were. For the next 35 years, it sat inaccessible to the public, slowly deteriorating under typhoon winds and salt spray. The island reopened for organized boat tours in 2009, and in 2015 was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site as part of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution sites. Though that designation came with significant controversy, as Korean and Chinese workers were subjected to forced labor on Hashima during World War II. Japan agreed as part of the UNESCO process to acknowledge this history and establish an information center. Neither promise has been substantively fulfilled, and the issue remains contested. The island was also used as visual inspiration for the villain's island lair in the 2012 James Bond film Skyfall. Number 8. Ikeshima, Nagasaki Prefecture. Most people who have heard of Gunkanjima have never heard of Ikeshima, which is remarkable considering the two islands are in the same prefecture, share almost identical histories, and Ikeshima is considerably easier to visit. Ikeshima is a small island off the Nishiheki Peninsula in Nagasaki. Before 1959, it was an agricultural and fishing island with a small permanent population. In 1959, coal mining operations began, and the island was transformed. By the 1970s, Ikeshima had a population of approximately 8,000 people crammed onto an island with a circumference of just 4 kilometers. Apartment blocks, a hospital, a school, a cinema, shops, and a bowling alley were all built to accommodate a community living on top of an undersea coal mine. In 1985, coal production peaked at more than 1.5 million tons extracted in a single year. The mine closed in November 2001 following a series of accidents and the pressure of cheap imported coal from overseas. Around 2,500 workers were made redundant. Most families left. As of 2021, approximately 111 people remained on the island, most of them retired miners or their relatives. The 8-story apartment blocks are still standing. The hospital still has equipment inside it. The mining infrastructure is still partially intact, and unlike Hashima, you can actually go inside it. A local tour operator runs a guided mine visit where visitors ride a small 3-wagon train into the undersea tunnel network, which reaches 300 meters below the surface. The retired miners who run the tour know the island's history firsthand, which gives the experience a quality that no museum can replicate. One travel writer noted after visiting, "The guys running the tour had worked those mines for decades. They weren't nostalgic exactly. more matter-of-fact about it, like men describing weather that had passed. The island is sometimes called the second Gunkanjima. The few people still living there might find that comparison irritating. It was its own place. It just had the misfortune of being in the shadow of a more famous ruin. Number 7. Nichitsu, Saitama Prefecture. If you are in Tokyo and you want to visit a ghost town, Nichitsu is the closest one you are likely to find that is worth the drive. Nichitsu is a former mining village tucked into the mountains of Saitama Prefecture, about 50 kilometers from Chichibu. The company whose name the village carries, Nichitsu, operated a tin and zinc mine in the area, and the settlement grew up around the need to house a workforce that had no practical way to commute from distant cities. At its peak, the village had around 3,000 residents. The company built everything necessary to sustain a community in relative isolation. 2 schools, a clinic with a full operating theater, a post office, a cinema, and rows of housing arranged across the mountainside. The senior employees lived in better positioned houses with tiled roofs and good sunlight exposure. Ordinary workers lived in apartments along the riverside that had no bathrooms. The hierarchy of a mid-century Japanese mining company was written into the architecture of the hillside. At some point in the 1980s, the village was abandoned. Buildings were left with their contents largely intact. The clinic, in particular, became something of a legend among Hokkaido explorers. Medical equipment, oxygen bottles, surgical instruments, and various records still occupying the rooms decades later. Early visitors reported finding what appeared to be preserved human tissue in the clinic's storage, though accounts vary and the specific details have grown more colorful with retelling over the years. What is not in dispute is that the clinic retained its contents long enough to thoroughly unsettle everyone who walked through it. Nichitsu is not a secret, and it is not particularly dangerous to explore the village portion, which is why experienced Hokkaido enthusiasts often bring newcomers there as an introduction. The mine area itself is more restricted and carries genuine safety risks, including unstable structures and active warning signs. The best time to visit is autumn, when the surrounding mountain sides turn orange and red, and the color contrast with the decaying concrete buildings creates the kind of photograph that gets passed around online and prompts someone to ask, "Where is that?" Number 6. Matsuo Mine, Iwate Prefecture. Matsuo Mine, in the mountains of Iwate Prefecture in the Tohoku region of northern Honshu, is one of those places that is difficult to categorize. It is too large to be a village and too empty to be a city. At its height, in the 1950s and 1960s, it was home to approximately 15,000 people who had come to work Japan's largest sulfur mine. The mine had been operating since 1909. After World War II, it became central to Japan's post-war industrial recovery. Sulfur was an essential raw material for chemical production and fertilizer manufacturing, both critical to rebuilding the country's agricultural and industrial capacity. The company town built around the mine included schools, hospitals, shopping facilities, and multi-story apartment blocks that sat high in the mountains at altitudes above 700 meters, giving the settlement a dramatic, isolated quality even when it was fully inhabited. The families who lived there were not just workers, they were a community with schools for the children, a hospital for the sick, and everything a functioning town needed, suspended in the mountains far from the nearest city. The global price of sulfur collapsed in the 1960s and 1970s as chemical manufacturing methods changed and sulfur became a cheap byproduct of petroleum refining rather than a mined commodity. The mine was no longer economically viable. Operations wound down, and the mine closed in 1972. The population dispersed. The apartment blocks, built to house thousands, were left standing in the mountain mist. What remains today are the brutalist concrete housing blocks, 9-story structures still largely intact despite decades of exposure to the harsh mountain winters and the persistent moisture of the highland climate. The site is accessed via a road that passes through an area where the drainage from the old mine has left the surrounding streams a vivid ochre color from sulfur and iron oxide, a landscape that is striking enough to be both beautiful and clearly wrong in a way you cannot immediately explain. The ruins sit high above the tree line, visible on clear days from a considerable distance, like a city that appeared in the wrong place and then reconsidered its decision. Local people sometimes call the area the Ghost City of the Clouds, which is dramatic, but not particularly inaccurate. Number 5. Kamiko, Yamaguchi Prefecture. Kamiko is not a name that appears in guidebooks, travel blogs, or tourism brochures, which is approximately the only thing you need to know to understand why it deserves a place on this list. The town of Kamiko in Yamaguchi Prefecture was once connected to the local copper mining industry that sustained several communities in the region through the mid-20th century. When the mines became unviable, the economic reason for the community's existence vanished, and so did most of the community. The departure was not sudden. It was the slow, decades-long emptying that characterizes most of Japan's rural depopulation story, where young people leave for cities first, then the school closes because there are not enough children, then the last shop shuts because there are not enough customers, then the last regular bus stops running because there are not enough passengers, and then one day, the last person makes a decision and the place becomes formally empty. What makes the abandoned structures of this region interesting to explorers is not dramatic industrial ruins or famous history. It is the ordinary domesticity left behind. Houses with furniture still in them, stacks of old magazines from the 1970s and 1980s, water damaged but still legible, kitchenware, children's toys, the things that people abandon when starting over somewhere else and deciding not to bring anything from the old life. Some objects are left because they are too heavy to move, some because they are not worth moving, some because the person who valued them is no longer the one making the decision. That particular kind of abandonment, the quiet, personal kind, is harder to describe than a collapsed factory, but arguably stranger to walk through. There are no dramatic ruins here, just rooms that still look like someone's kitchen and bedroom and the specific weight of a place where no one will ever be cooking or sleeping again. Number 4. Nagoro, Doll Village, Tokushima Prefecture. Nagoro is not entirely a ghost town. It has residents. The problem is that most of them are dolls. The village of Nagoro sits in a remote mountain valley in Tokushima Prefecture, on the island of Shikoku. In the early 2000s, a local woman named Tsukimi Ayano returned to the village where she had grown up and found that most of it had emptied. Schools were closed. Houses stood vacant. The population, which had once numbered around 300, had dwindled to a handful of elderly residents. Ayano began making life-sized stuffed dolls to represent the people who had left, and then the people who had died. She placed them in the places where people used to be, working in the fields, sitting at desks in the empty school, waiting at the bus stop, fishing from the bank of the river, leaning against walls as if resting between tasks. Each doll was crafted by hand over several days, dressed in whatever clothes matched the person or the pose, and positioned with enough specificity to suggest a particular life, rather than a generic placeholder. By the time international media began covering Nagoro in the mid-2000s, the dolls outnumbered the living residents by a ratio of roughly 10-to-1. At last count, there were more than 350 dolls in the village, and fewer than 30 actual people. The dolls are eerie in the way that empty spaces shaped like people are always eerie. They are also, in a way, a community project. Each one represents someone who was there, someone with a name, someone Ayano knew. The empty school classroom filled with doll children facing a doll teacher is not exactly cheerful, but it is one of the more genuinely original responses to rural depopulation that anyone has come up with. A Japanese documentary filmmaker made a short film about Ayano and Nagoro in 2012 called The Valley of Dolls, which brought international attention to a village that most people in Japan itself had never heard of. The village still receives visitors drawn by curiosity, who walk the road through the valley and encounter the silent population at every corner. Ayano continues making new dolls as more residents pass away or leave. The living population and the doll population are moving in opposite directions, and it is increasingly clear which one is winning. Number 3. Matsushima Mine Ruins, Nagasaki Prefecture. This entry requires a small geographical note. The Matsushima area in Nagasaki is not to be confused with Matsushima Bay in Miyagi Prefecture, which is famous for its pine-covered islands and considered one of Japan's 3 official scenic views. The Nagasaki Matsushima is considerably less scenic and considerably more abandoned. The Matsushima coal mine in Nagasaki Prefecture operated for decades before the broader collapse of the Japanese coal industry consigned it to the same fate as virtually every other mine in the country. The company housing, industrial structures, and community facilities that once served the mine's workforce are now in varying states of collapse and overgrowth. What distinguishes this location from similar sites is its relative obscurity even within the Hokkaido community. While Gunkanjima and Ikeshima draw the attention and the tour boats, sites like this one exist in a quieter category of abandonment, known to dedicated explorers, largely unknown to casual visitors, and slowly returning to the landscape at its own pace. Japan has hundreds of sites in this category. The country's post-war industrialization was so rapid and so geographically distributed that almost every prefecture has its equivalent. A place that existed because of a specific industry, served that industry loyally, and disappeared when the industry did. Number 2. Ashio Copper Mine Town, Tochigi Prefecture. Ashio is one of the oldest and most historically significant mine sites in Japan, and it is also the site of what is considered the country's first major industrial pollution disaster. The Ashio copper mine in Tochigi Prefecture operated from 1610, though it rose to prominence during the Meiji era as Japan's largest copper mine. By the late 19th century, the mine was producing roughly 40% of Japan's total copper output. The Furukawa Mining Company, which acquired the mine in 1877, built an extensive company town around it, housing, schools, infrastructure, all to support the workforce extracting ore from the mountain. The problem was that the copper smelting process was releasing sulfur dioxide and other contaminants into the surrounding environment on a catastrophic scale. By the 1890s, rice paddies along the Waterase River were dying, fish were disappearing from the water, farmers downstream were losing their livelihoods. Forests on the surrounding hillsides were stripped bare by acid rain from the smelters, leaving the mountains raw and eroding. A government investigation in 1897 confirmed the damage, and the case became a national scandal. Diet member Shozo Tanaka resigned his seat in 1901 to protest directly to the emperor about the situation, an extraordinary act in Meiji Japan. The government's response was to drain the Yanaka Reservoir and flood the farmland of Yanaka Village downstream, effectively destroying the community to serve as a flood retention basin for the contaminated river water. Around 2,700 people were displaced. The mine continued operating until 1973. After its closure, the surrounding area has undergone decades of environmental remediation. The company town has largely been demolished or absorbed into the broader landscape. A mine museum exists in the area, and parts of the old mining infrastructure can be visited. What remains of the worker housing and community buildings tells the story of a place that was built to last and then dismantled by its own history. But the broader story of Ashio is about what industries do to the places around them when nobody is paying sufficient attention, and what it costs to fix it afterward. Number 1. Hokkaido's Phantom Villages, Hokkaido. The largest island of Japan's northern frontier is a different country from the rest of the archipelago in many ways. Harsher winters, more space, a different settlement history, and a specific demographic crisis that is rewriting the map faster than anywhere else in Japan. Hokkaido was settled primarily during the Meiji period as part of Japan's internal colonization program. The indigenous Ainu people had lived there for centuries, but the mainland migration from the 1870s onwards built farms, towns, and mining communities across the island's interior. Many of these communities were built on single industries: coal, timber, fishing, or agriculture. When those industries contracted or collapsed, the communities had no alternative economic base and no reason to remain. The speed of the depopulation in some areas has been extraordinary. Communities that had several hundred people in the 1970s were down to single digits by the 1990s, and to zero shortly after. Today, Hokkaido has what Japanese planners call phantom settlements, communities that have lost their legal recognition because their population fell below the threshold required for administrative classification, villages that no longer appear on official local government maps, communities whose last residents died or moved away so recently that their houses still contain the contents of daily life. The village of Matsushima in Hokkaido, for instance, once had over 1,000 residents connected to local farming and forestry operations. Today, it has none. The schoolhouse stands. The houses stand. The roads have been quietly reclaimed by the surrounding landscape. This pattern is not unusual. Hokkaido has dozens of sites like this, scattered across an island that is still physically enormous and increasingly hollow. The Japanese government uses the term Genkai Shuraku, marginal villages, to describe communities where more than half the population is over 65, and the settlement is considered unlikely to survive as a functioning community. Hokkaido has more of these per square kilometer than almost anywhere else in Japan. Some researchers estimate that several hundred such communities will cease to exist in a functional sense by 2040. The land will remain. The addresses will remain. The communities will not. One researcher studying rural depopulation in Hokkaido put it simply: the land doesn't go anywhere. The roads stay. The buildings stay. For a while. The people just stop. Japan has a formal plan to consolidate rural populations into larger settlements over the coming decades. Whether it works or not, Hokkaido's phantom villages will keep accumulating. The country is running out of people faster than it is running out of places for them to have lived. And somewhere on a mountain road in Hokkaido, there is a village with a name on a sign at the edge of a forest and absolutely nothing moving inside it. 11 places. Some of them are famous in certain circles and completely unknown outside of them. Some are so quiet that even dedicated explorers drive past them without knowing what they were. All of them are parts of Japan that the tourism industry has very little interest in showing you, partly because they don't fit the narrative and partly because there is genuinely nothing to sell you there. But they are real, and they tell a story that the bullet trains and the neon signs don't. Japan's ghost towns are not just relics of industries that failed. They are also the country's demographic future, arriving ahead of schedule in specific places, leaving the buildings behind as evidence of what a community looks like when the reason for it disappears. More than 8 million homes in Japan are currently classified as akiya, vacant or abandoned properties. That number is projected to grow significantly over the coming decades as the population continues to age and decline. Ghost towns are not accidents here. They are, increasingly, a predictable outcome of larger forces that nobody has quite managed to reverse. The industry that failed, the mine that ran out, the park that couldn't compete, the village where the last child was born 50 years ago and nobody noticed in time. These are not edge cases. They are the future arriving in places that made the mistake of being first. If this gave you something to think about, or better yet, somewhere to put on a map, that is more than enough. Give this video a like if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. There is a great deal more like this coming, and we would love to have you along for it.